The majestic Airbus A380 earned the title of the world's biggest airliner when it entered service, and from the very start, passengers absolutely loved it. But in the end, Airbus ended up losing money on every one of the 251 A380s they ended up selling, which led them to end the program even before Boeing stopped making the 747, which was the type that the A380 was supposed to have replaced. Now, how did Airbus manage to go so wrong with this aircraft, and did Boeing somehow trick them into making this really expensive mistake? Stay tuned. Recently, I've been talking a lot about how Boeing managed to get, well, quite a few things wrong in recent years, but Airbus has not got everything right either. A few months ago, I made a video looking at the very first step of Airbus, which they took when they introduced the fantastic Airbus A380. Now, even though the A380 was a very slow seller in the beginning, it eventually ended up showing the airlines how good a twin-engine widebody could actually be. And that was obviously because it was just so much more efficient than the tri-jets, the DC-10 and the Lockheed L-1011, that the airlines were comparing it with. Now, this was an especially big deal after the 1973 oil crisis, although it took quite a while for everyone to fully get the message. But Boeing definitely noticed this, and they later launched the Boeing 767 following Airbus's example. But still, Airbus had been the first to launch a twin-engine widebody, and for a company that was just entering the market, this was a pretty great call, right? Well, in reality, Airbus actually got a little bit lucky here in a couple of ways. Obviously, the timing of the oil crisis wasn't in their control, and contrary to how Lockheed and McDonnell Douglas was envisioning for their widebodies to be used, Airbus believed that the main use of the A380 would be in the medium-haul market and mostly over land. Early versions of the L-1011 and the DC-10 were also oriented towards medium-haul, but from the very beginning, long-haul versions were also in the works. And in practice, the regulations back then made that third engine an absolute requirement, at least for long over water legs, which I'll get back to soon. Without this long-haul role in mind, at least in the beginning, Airbus didn't need a third engine for the A380, which made the aircraft much more economic. The fuel consumption and overall maintenance costs for 2 instead of 3 or 4 engines are just way lower. Anyway, after gaining acceptance as an aircraft manufacturing group, Airbus then started working on what would soon become the Airbus A320 family. And after that, they revisited their widebody lineup. They started with a shortened, updated Airbus A300 called the A310, and they then continued with the Airbus A340 and the A330, who actually all used the same A300 fuselage. Airbus really wanted to make themselves true equals to Boeing, and in the minds of a lot of people in the company, Airbus couldn't really take on Boeing fully unless its own aircraft lineup covered all of the aircraft that Boeing had in their lineup. Now, the period that I'm referring to here is the late 1980s, and this was a very busy time for both Airbus and Boeing. In the United States in 1988, Boeing was test flying the then new Boeing 747-400, and at the same time they were talking to airlines about a new plane, which would eventually become the majestic Boeing 777. In Europe, Airbus had just introduced the Airbus A320 and was still putting the finishing touches on the remaining members of that family, was also developing the A340 and the A330 widebodies. So everyone was really busy, but like I said, Airbus saw itself as the one catching up in this race. Now, even with most of their engineers busy, there were still some people at Airbus who were thinking of the next step to do. In particular, they were looking at the Queen of the Skies, the Boeing 747-400, which Boeing was just about to introduce. Now, Airbus wouldn't actually launch the Airbus A380 until over a decade later, but to engineers and planners at Airbus, it was seen as the next logical step to take, even as far back as in the late 1980s. The way they saw it, the A330 was their small, twin-engine widebody, while the A340 had the range to take care of long-haul with higher capacity, and their A320 family would compete comfortably with the Boeing 737. Now, I'm sure you see where this is all going. Airbus believed that the A340 would hold its own pretty well against Boeing's coming 777, and that the only one left in the Boeing lineup was the 747 that they needed to cover. And of course, the fact that a newer version of that 747 was just entering service was too much for senior Airbus engineers to just ignore. Simply put, Creating their own double-decker to pit against the wildly successful Boeing 747 was a question of both business strategy and prestige for Airbus. As the authors Guy Norris and Mark Wagner explained, there was also another motivation for Airbus to design a monster like this. Basically, Airbus's engineers would need something to do once the A320, A330 and A340 programs entered service, but obviously this new program would have to make economical sense in order for them to get the green light for it. It would still take several years of studies before the planning of this aircraft even became public, and when it did, Airbus referred to it as the Ultra High Capacity Aircraft, or UHCA. Now, those involved in this project could clearly see that this aircraft would require several innovations to both design and materials in order to become a reality. And logistically, this new plane would also be an extreme test of Airbus's strategy of building aircraft using parts made in different factories all over Europe. From the very beginning of their existence, Airbus had relied heavily on its fleet of Super Guppy and later Belugas to move large aircraft parts across its factories in Europe. But this was never going to work for the A380 parts. They were simply just too big. Instead, Airbus would need to rely on, for example, barges to move finished wings from Wales in the UK down a river and then over to France. The Belugas were eventually also used to fly some smaller parts, while other bits travelled via road convoys, for example. It was also obvious that the plane's enormous size would continue to be a problem even after its introduction. To accommodate these giants, airports would need long runways, wider taxiways and extra large gates, larger than the gates meant for even the 747. So a lot of airports had to modify their jetways and other infrastructure in order to be able to handle this new giant. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. The point is that both making and selling the A380 to the airlines would be a risky and costly project to do. And as I explained before, some of the early reasons why Airbus was even looking at making this aircraft, like prestige and keeping its designers or engineers busy, were, well, a little bit questionable maybe. But in the decade that followed those initial plans, more and more people at Airbus started getting convinced that the ultra-high capacity aircraft made perfect sense, after a bit of cajoling by Boeing, according to some, and I'll explain exactly what I mean by that after this. Father's Day is coming up, and if you're looking for that perfect gift that really stands out, well then check out this awesome thing right here. This is a hover pen from today's sponsor, Novium, and Novium creates these truly unique, high-end products inspired by the vastness and wonders of space. I always use this pen because it both feels good, it writes incredibly well, and when I'm trying to come up with ways of explaining something that's really technical, I often just find myself spinning this thing, and it really helps me think. Now, my absolute favorite design is this one, the Stellar Edition, which features a precise 23.5-degree angle, which is a nod to the Earth's actual tilt. And it was actually recognized by Time in 2022 as one of the best inventions in its field, and I can definitely see why. Now, this one comes in a range of colors, and the Premium Edition have an 18-karat gold-plated finish, and it actually also has a real meteorite embedded into it, which is just really awesome. Now, if you want two pens in one, a rollerball and a fountain, I would recommend their latest release, the Future Edition, which has this smart interchangeable tip. To get one of these for yourself, use the link here below or scan this QR code together with the code Mentour. This will give you an awesome 10% discount with free shipping to most countries. Thank you, Novium. Now back to the video. To understand how Airbus became convinced that they needed to develop the A380, it's worth taking a quick look at the Airbus A330 and A340. Specifically, we need to look at how Airbus prioritized the development of those two widebodies. The A340 entered service first in March of 1993, about 10 months before the A330. Now, other than the number of the engines, their lengths and one extra main landing gear on the A340, these two aircraft were nearly identical, and because of that they also shared a pilot type rating along with almost all of their other systems. They even shared the same wing, which meant that the legacy A330 became a bit heavier than it needed to be, and that was a conscious development cost saving for Airbus, which seemed to be worth it because the A340 was actually going to be the higher priority. And why was that then? Well, as a four-engine aircraft, the A340 could fly long, oceanic routes without something known as ETOPS restrictions. ETOPS stands for Extended Twin Engine Operations Performance Standards, and as I explained before, these standards has to do mainly with long oceanic flights. You see, before the 1970s, twin-engine aircraft weren't allowed to fly more than 60 minutes away from a diversion airport, but aircraft with more than two engines could. But as jet engines became more and more reliable, these rules were gradually extended, first to 90 minutes and then to 120, and now some twin-engine aircraft have the 330 minutes or 5.5 hour ETOPS approval. Now, not everyone expected ETOPS approvals to go that far, including Airbus, which is actually a little bit ironic since it was actually the Airbus A380 that became the first twin to get a 90-minute ETOPS approval back in 1976. Either way, this way of thinking was what convinced Airbus that, especially when it came to a really large jet, which would compete with the 747, ETOPS wasn't really a concern. It would need more than two engines. But what about the size then? Now, passenger capacities vary quite a lot between airlines, but in general, a Boeing 747-400, for example, typically seats around 370 to 400 passengers. But in the case of the Airbus A380, most airliners have 500 or more seats, and a few have even pushed that past 600. And that of course begs the question, how big was the world's demand for aircraft that were that huge? Estimating the size of that market became a key goal for both Airbus and Boeing, and that was because during the 1990s, Boeing was also considering its next steps with the 747. Was it worth enlarging it, or was there even a market for an all-new replacement? I've discussed the details of the hub and spoke versus point-to-point models in previous videos, so I'm not going to go into great detail here. But what you need to know is that the hub and spoke was the prevailing model at the time, and Airbus expected it to stay that way. As its name suggests, this is a model where an airline has one or sometimes a couple of really big bases or hubs, which it mainly operates out of, and from those the airline then flies to smaller destinations or spokes. This model favors big aircraft since the landing slots will quickly become limiting at the hubs, but it only works for really big aircraft if the smaller spoke destinations also have enough potential passengers to fill them. The newer point-to-point operating model is where an airline flies between multiple city pairs without congesting one airport in particular, and this system generally favors slightly smaller aircraft, and passengers also tend to prefer this model since it offers more options for non-stop flights. For the airlines, which system is better depends on where and how many big hubs they actually have, and also what the rest of their network looks like. And here is where Boeing had an edge over Airbus. You see, since they were a bigger seller of widebodies, Boeing could clearly see that there was an appetite for a switch from hub and spoke over to the point-and-point model. That's actually why they had developed the all-new 777 instead of making an updated version of the Boeing 747 SP. The 747 SP had worked reasonably well, but only in some niche markets since its efficiency didn't make it desirable for other routes. Now, Boeing had looked at a version with the updated engines of the 747-400, but ultimately the twin-engine 777 was just a much better and more versatile aircraft. Even the smallest, early 777-200 had seats for over 300 passengers, and it also had ETOPS approval for 180 minutes right from its launch. And that, the growth of potential destinations that could now be better serviced with jets like the 777, made judging the market for future superjumbos really hard to do. And here is where things get a little bit more interesting and perhaps also a bit conspiratorial. When I said earlier that both Airbus and Boeing were trying to estimate the size of a future jumbo market, I meant that they were doing that research partially together. In 1993, Boeing and DASA, a German aerospace company that was then a key member of the Airbus consortium, announced a joint research project to evaluate the viability and market size for an ultra-high capacity aircraft. You see, at the time, Airbus wasn't a single company. Instead, it was a group of companies who worked together to produce a line of airliners. And technically, each company could not only do its own research, but also develop aircraft with an outsider, like for example Boeing. The only catch was that DASA and other consortium companies couldn't design aircraft with a capacity between 100 and 350 passenger seats. In other words, they couldn't design something that was directly competing with Airbus jets. But they could do whatever they liked outside of those parameters. That corporation was a surprise move, and authors Gay Norris and Mark Wagner explained that a lot of people in the industry saw this as an attempt by Boeing to try and destabilize Airbus, which seems quite plausible. But of course, Boeing strongly denied this and argued that launching an all-new aircraft for such an unknown market would be an incredibly risky thing to do alone. Such a plane would cost at least $10 to $15 billion to develop, so joining forces with another manufacturer would make a lot of sense, especially if the market wasn't big enough for two competitors. And of course, if that made some Europeans uneasy while researching it, well, that didn't hurt either, I guess. But while many thought that Boeing did this to destabilize their competitors, others had a different theory. And that was that Boeing was actively trying to trick Airbus into launching its superjumbo project. Boeing was well aware that Airbus was suffering from what some aerospace analysts called fuselage envy. So the theory was that if Boeing could stoke this desire by using this joint market research, showing that some sort of double-decker would follow the existing 747, this could nudge Airbus in the right direction. This would be, while in reality, Boeing had already settled on an aircraft the size of the Boeing 787 and not on a 747 replacement. So, was this what actually happened? Well, it's actually hard to know for sure. There were some indications that the German company who collaborated with Boeing ended up being skeptical about Airbus's plans to build the A380, and if that's true, then that would talk against that kind of conspiracy. Actually, from what we have been able to find when we've been researching this, it's actually more likely that Boeing just wanted to delay Airbus's decision until they knew what they wanted to do themselves. What is an absolute fact, though, is that no matter what the reason was for it, Boeing and Airbus eventually drew radically different conclusions from that joint market research. The different companies within Airbus didn't fully agree, like I mentioned, but in the end, they concluded that there was a potential market for 1,200 superjumbos. And they hoped to make at least 750 of them to make the program profitable. Boeing, on the other hand, believed that the total size of the market was just 800 aircraft or so, and that included a freighter variant. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, we know that both Airbus and Boeing were very, very wrong in these market estimates. Airbus ended up only selling a total of 251 A380s, and even if we add to this the 36 passenger 747-8s that Boeing sold, we are well short of those other lofty numbers that they were talking about. In any case, Boeing had correctly concluded that even their prediction of 800 orders weren't enough for two competing all-new jets, so they instead just examined the possibility of launching an enlarged and re-winged version of the 747-400. Boeing went public with those plans back in 1996, announcing versions called the 747-500X and the 600X, and even a more radical 700X. But the airlines just weren't interested, not even in a later proposal for a more modest 747 stretch. But although that was the case, initially a lot of people in the industry criticized Boeing for remaining idle while Airbus continued to innovate. But Boeing were adamant that they had done their homework. The market just wasn't there. Having said that though, Scott Hamilton explains in his book Air Wars that when Singapore Airlines rejected the 747-500 in favor of the A380, that really started the Boeing sales teams. Maybe they had done a huge mistake here. And Airbus, they even offered to help airlines with some of the airport infrastructure changes that the A380 would require in order to convince them to start buying it. Now, Airbus formally launched the A380 in December of 2000 with 50 orders from 6 different airlines, and then due to a number of technological issues and just some general problems arising from the sheer size of the jet, they were hit by delays of over 2 years. As a result of that, Airbus abandoned their plans for a possible freighter version, losing 20 orders from FedEx and UPS in the process. But even more importantly here, remember those development costs that Boeing had estimated to be between $10 and $15 billion? Well, estimates vary here, but most analysts believe that the A380 actually ended up costing between $20 and $25 billion to develop. And if that's true, it never stood a chance of ever becoming profitable. Arguably though, Airbus were actually a bit unlucky here. The A380's engines were already getting a bit out of date at the time that it entered service, and in terms of the efficiency of it, the plane also had another issue. You see, the full name of this jet is actually the Airbus A380-800, and that's because Airbus originally planned to introduce an even bigger A380-900 at a later date. Now, that obviously never happened, but the A380's wing, even though it's incredibly efficient, was sized to work with the even greater weight of the 900 variant, similar to how Airbus had dealt with the A330 and the A340 earlier. But that fact meant, of course, that the wings that were fitted to this version of the A380 that we've all seen is actually a bit heavier and bigger than they need to be, and therefore also less efficient. In the end, Emirates was the only airline that has the kind of hubs and network that allows it to scale operations with the A380 effectively. They bought 123 of them, almost half of all A380s ever made, and they would have bought more if Airbus had offered a re-engined variant. With no more orders in the books, Airbus in 2019 announced that the very last ever Airbus A380 would go to Emirates in 2021, meaning that the aircraft would be cemented as a financial flop, even though both passengers and pilots absolutely loved it. Now, Airbus had obviously felt where the winds were blowing way earlier, because already in 2006, with the Airbus A380 still in development, Airbus had launched the A350, realizing that they had to provide an efficient, twin-engine alternative to their four-engine behemoth. And that aircraft has obviously been doing exceptionally well. Boeing eventually built the 747-8 for a fraction of what the A380 cost to make, but it ended up mostly being sold as a freighter. No US airline ever bought the 747-8, nor any Airbus A380 for that matter. Finally, one interesting late news piece about the A380 story is Global Airlines. This new British company hopes to start operations with 4 A380s and has already acquired 2 of them, with Highfly Malta listed as their operator. Now, I might get back to this airline in the future as I find their business idea quite fascinating, but it seems obvious that scaling up operations in the Emirates ways isn't really in Global's plans. For now, the odds seems to be stacked against them, but time will tell if Global will be just a footnote in the A380's history or an unexpected start of its resurgence. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below and leave a like if you enjoyed the video. By the way, did you know that we're actually 7 people working in my team here on Mentour Pilot? If you want to support the type of videos that we create and have some real input into how we do it, then please consider joining my fantastic Patreon crew by using the link somewhere here on the screen or in the description below. You can also support us by buying some merch or sending us super thanks or just watching these videos next. Everything really helps. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.